To me, this is one of the most interesting and challenging topics out there. We all love our technology, but there's a cost. And sometimes the cost is obvious, usability versus privacy, and sometimes the costs are more complex and less evident to us as consumers and even citizens. So our goal for this discussion today is to explore some of these costs. Technology, as we know, has multiple uses, for good and for harm. So over the next hour, we want to explore some of the ethical questions and concerns that are being stirred up by technological developments. How do we spot them? What do we do about them? How do we think about them going forward? Again, I'm going to sort of reintroduce briefly the panelists. To my immediate left is Rana Kaliouby, who is an Egyptian-born computer scientist who founded and runs Affectiva, which is an emotion recognition startup in Boston. She's also very active in some of the big international groups that are concerned with ethics and regulation of AI. And then Danielle Allen, who is a university professor at Harvard, who directs Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. So anyway, big topic. There are a lot of areas we can go into. We will talk for, 30 or 40 minutes among ourselves, and then I really want to open this up to questions. I think probably everybody has a concern or an anecdote or something about the kind of ethical fault lines, the good and the bad, the opportunity and the risk of technology. So I really want to open it to the floor before long. So I want to start with a personal anecdote of my own and throw it to you all to comment on it. So I have a granddaughter, 5 years old, and I am an idiot, so I post pictures of myself and her on Facebook. And I got in a discussion recently with another journalist who said, you cannot do that. That she's 5 years old, you are making a decision for her that you should not make, because we don't know what facial recognition technology is doing now, let alone what it might do in the future. I responded by saying, this is a trade-off I'm comfortable with. I lived overseas. I have friends all over the world. They see her. If she grows up and wants to go to Berlin or Shanghai, she now has friends all over the world. It's a fair trade-off for me. Interestingly, all the other people who jumped on that thread took his side and not mine. So I think this is kind of interesting. And I guess I want to throw that out right now, because this is something I really didn't even think about. And all these concerned people said, look, basically, you can't do that. So there's an assumption that technology is dark and will be used against us even in ways that we don't realize. So, Rana, do you want to take the first crack at that? But I'd love to hear both of you. You hear that anecdote. What do you think?
Yeah, I think this really brings to bear the conversations that are really at the forefront of building technology, and specifically AI today, which is, first of all, these systems are becoming really mainstream, they're becoming ubiquitous, and they know a lot about us, right? There's a lot of data out there about us, and some of it is very personal data. And I don't think we've really thought through around data privacy considerations, consent, like who gets to share their consent. I mean, you're consenting your granddaughter, but you don't actually have explicit consent from her. And then there's the whole conversation around unintended, uses of this technology. So right now it might be pretty benign, but there are definitely potential misuses of the technology. So what I like about your anecdote, though, is that this spurred a dialogue, a very open conversation around, where do we draw the line, and how do we make it so that it's comfortable for everybody to share this information. Yeah.
So my story or anecdote there is that I'm basically not on Facebook, so I have to confess to that up front. So I'm going to be one of those troglodytes. Yeah, it's a little complicated, but basically not at all. Yeah, you can press me on that later if you want to. I am on Twitter, though, and so I do often have the instinct of wanting to share a picture of my kids because we've just done something really great, and I'm just so excited about it, and I always stop myself. So I have given myself an absolute rule that I will not post pictures of my children on social media. So why is that exactly? So at the end of the day, I think the questions that we're dealing with are actually mostly old questions, but we don't always recognize them. In this particular instance, I think what social media has done is to give us all a public persona. by definition. As soon as you have fragments of yourself up on social media, you have a public persona. What do I mean by that exactly? Celebrities are public persons, okay? And the law treats them differently because they have accepted their self-exposure to a broadly interested public. So it treats them differently with regard to defamation, with regard to libel, with regard to privacy, a whole slew of things. So as I see social media, the basic thing it has done is to turn us all into public persons without our having really registered that. So I think good dialogue and conversation is a helpful place to start, but I also think we have resources in the history of what it's been like to be a public person that can help us think about our own personal ethical decisions around social media use.
Well, so let's keep going on that. So my experience is that people in the US generally seem to accept usability over privacy. I would say this is huge generalizations, but in China that seems to be a trade-off people are happy to make. Less so in Europe. You say that these are old questions. Of course they are, but something changed, and I don't know if it's the fact that we became, as they say, we're the business model. That our data is what are animating these enormous kind of social media sites. It happened sort of without our consent, and we don't really know how to get out of it. It almost comes down to the question, so let's talk about these platforms. Are they neutral, and it's up to content providers and ourselves, or do we have to recognize, no, technology is not neutral, it never is. You have to be thinking about both obvious and unintended consequences.
I would say that platforms are about as neutral as cities are. Okay, now what does that mean exactly? What does it mean to say that a city is neutral or not neutral? So some cities grow up organically, higgledy-piggledy in all kinds of ways. Some are built by city planners. Some have really intense zoning laws that segregate zones by income in effect. Others, in Texas more commonly, don't have many zoning laws. You get a very different kind of city. So the point is that platforms are designing communities that function across basically all domains of human existence in the same way that cities are designing communities that function across all domains of human existence. So platforms are exactly as neutral as cities.
That's an interesting analogy. I haven't heard that before. I kind of agree. Like, technology is neutral by and large, and it's up to us as thought leaders, as innovators, as practitioners to really think through the different use cases. I'll draw from my own experience. So my entire research career and now at Affectiva, my company, we are in the business of building artificial emotional intelligence. So AI is taking on roles that were traditionally done by humans and acting on your behalf, helping with your healthcare, driving your cars. And a lot of the emphasis in building these AI systems is very focused on the IQ, the cognitive intelligence of these systems, as no one's really thinking about the EQ, the emotional and social intelligence of these technologies. And so that's what we're about. We're about adding EQ and empathy and emotional intelligence to our devices, taking a very human-centric approach. And so, we build algorithms that detect human faces and map your expressions into a variety of reactions and emotions. And we've recently added vocal intonation as well. So that means that there's a lot of there are a lot of applications. It's very transformative across industries, and some use cases I'm extremely passionate about, and I'm proud that we get to advance the science. There's applications in mental health, there's applications in automotive to make sure that our cars are safer. But there's also applications that, in my opinion, blur the line, like, applying it for lie detection or surveillance or law enforcement. And that's where I think, I think as folks who are designing these AI systems, and also other stakeholders like ethicists and human rights activists, we need to all come to the table and agree on what's fair and what's not fair uses of the technology.
So we were talking backstage and agreed that technologists tend to be more optimistic about technology and a technological solution to some of the problems maybe than civilians are. But I want to quote somebody who is a tech person, Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, who, in a book that he's got out called Tools and Weapons, I think, he said technology is not neutral. Even the best technologies have unintended consequences, and the benefits are seldom spread uniformly. And this is before the new technology is misused for harmful ends, as it inevitably will be. I think in a sense, he was saying it's not enough to say, I built this platform. If you abuse it, that's on you. That rather, I built this platform and to think hard about what is around the corner and how to avoid some of the problems that we all experience.
So I would agree with that. So I'm going to come back to the comparison to cities. So when I said platforms are exactly as neutral as cities, I wasn't actually saying platforms are neutral, right? I was saying we can tell the difference between cities that work and cities that don't work, between cities where there's a whole lot of injustice in how some residents experience life in the city, and cities that broadly support the flourishing of all the communities in that city. So what I was doing with the analogy actually was trying to give us all access to a common set of tools that we use every single day for assessing how well a city is doing. Because every single one of those tools that you use for assessing Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, Detroit, obviously in a very different situation than Boston, all those same tools can be used for thinking about how platforms are doing. So I would agree with Brad Smith that platforms are responsible for the world that is the necessary consequence of their design. They don't design everything that happens there, but their designs have consequences, and they should be responsible for them.
I think at the core, the technology itself, if you just look at the core technology, it is neutral. It's how we decide to use it. And of course, the unintended consequences of how it's getting used, that's where it's not neutral, right? And that's where it can go, it can be really transformative and it can help a lot of people or it can hurt a lot of people.
So, all right, so that's fine. So let's talk practical then. So let's take Facebook. So one thing that was not imagined that we're living with, not just on Facebook, is the weaponization of fake news. So I guess a question, I don't know if there's an ethical question, should a publisher or a platform take out the extremes, really extreme or life-threatening posts, but otherwise not police it as a platform? We're not content creators. Or, and I'm a journalist, I fear for, we're not even into the deep fakes area, which scares me even more, but so what do you do? So they've created this unintended consequences. What is the right thing then for a platform to do in a community that values free speech, but also is appalled by some of this?
So I will answer your question, but I also want to first come back to something Rana said. I want to push on this issue of neutrality a little bit. I'm going to make the case that technology is never neutral and can never be neutral, though once it's made, it can be used better or worse ways. And why not? Every technology is a designed solution to a problem, where the design, among other things, is seeking often to optimize something, all right? The choice about the problem, the choice of what you're optimizing, are agenda-setting, priority-making decisions. And every time we make a decision about where to invest our collective energies, we are making a decision about how to shape our world. So that's the sense in which technology is never neutral, all right? So it may be that then the problem that you design. You want to come back? Okay, well, I'll stop.
No, keep going. Of
Well, I mean, maybe that then the technology that you design, you yourself aren't trying to control the variety of possible use cases, and you can imagine a whole variety of good and bad use cases of that thing. But that first priority setting, agenda setting moment is incredibly important for shaping our world.
Yeah, I don't actually totally disagree, but again, I want to reduce it to practice. So in our case, the very first application we explored for emotion recognition was helping kids on the autism spectrum read and understand nonverbal communication. And so this was at MIT. We built kind of an initial version of a Google Glass. That was in 2006, before Google Glass existed. And you had a little camera, and the camera was connected to this emotion recognition device, and it told you in real time what are the other, what are the expressions of people you're interacting with. Like, are they excited? Are they confused? Are they bored? Are you monologuing? And we deployed it, so yes, it was designed for a particular use case. Fast forward a few years at the company, we released a software development kit of that core recognition technology, emotion recognition technology, and we just put it out there because we said, there are lots of applications, we can't build all of them. So we're going to build an ecosystem of partners and collaborators who can take this and apply it to different industries. And very quickly we learned that, yes, we designed it with an initial use case, but people are applying in all sorts of ways, some very creative, some very inspiring, and some, for us, cross the line of what's acceptable. And so we had to go back and kind of revise our terms and conditions, and we enforced that everybody has to use it for consent. We said, no, can't use it in the following industries: surveillance, law enforcement, lie detection, sex robots, because it's a thing. So that was, so.
So it's just, the question really is, does it matter to use the word neutral? And I would say it matters because I think it's misleading for people, not trying to be difficult or anything like that, but much, from my point of view, more helpful to just remember that technology inevitably has dual use or plural kinds of use, good and bad. So it's always a question of what's the good and what's the bad here, not, sort of starting from the fact that it's neutral. I just think the idea of neutrality can lead us astray by leading us to not ask questions we should ask, even about the first purpose for which something was designed.
So maybe we can come back to the Facebook thing, maybe not, but I want to ask, is there a framework for thinking about unintended consequences? So on facial recognition, there's that case that I'm sure you're well familiar with. Kenneth Kidd, a geneticist at Yale, sort of unknowingly, unintentionally helped China in its scary facial recognition technology that is identifying and imprisoning Uyghurs in Xinjiang. He didn't mean that. He was giving advice on that he thought was about ancestry and 23andMe kind of stuff, and it was used and abused by a state that you could argue in hindsight you shouldn't have been surprised that is what Beijing wanted to do with that kind of technology. So how do we think about that? And are there, does an ethicist have rules for the inevitable unintended consequences that will grow out of these developments?
So, as it happens, yes. Not rules exactly, but processes. And the relevant space to look is bioethics, or you could go back sort of longer and look at the history of nuclear weapons technology, for example. But at any rate, if you look at bioethics and the history of genetic transformations from the 70s to the present, bioethicists have, on the whole, done a pretty good job of building within the scientific community processes by which people sort of stop at the point that they're doing something in a petri dish and really think about what are the possible consequences they can imagine. What does it take for them to assess the risk before they move into a mouse model, for example, if they're going to sort of start moving into work in sort of human context. So the point is just that you cannot up front answer all questions about unintended consequences. You have to have a process for repeated iterative risk assessment in relationship to criteria and standards that a community committed to academic freedom and also beneficence, that is to say public benefit, deliberative considerations for democratic decision-making, and justice and fairness. There are sort of criteria like that that are kind of built into a risk assessment process. And if you can build that into your ongoing work, then I think unintended consequences are much easier to foresee and to deal with when you have failed to foresee them.
So now maybe from somebody who is in the business, you seem like you think about these issues a lot. Does Affectiva, your company, have kind of core values that touch on this?
Yes, we definitely have a number of core values that have acted like our North Star, if you like. So when we first started the company, my co-founder, Professor Rosalind Picard, who's a professor at MIT Media Lab, and I kind of sat around her kitchen table in her house, just 20 minutes away from here, and we said, okay, there are going to be a lot of applications and industries that will approach us for this technology. What core values are we going to use to guide our decisions? And we agreed that first and foremost, everything we needed to do was on a consent basis, so opt-in, not opt-out. We wanted to respect people's privacy because this data is extremely personal. And we realized that you have to get some value in return for sharing your data. And that meant that there were a few industries that we weren't going to entertain, like surveillance, and we got tested on that. So we spun out in 2009, and 2 years later, we were running out of funding. So we were 2 months away from literally not making payroll. And so we were in fundraising mode, and we got a phone call from the intelligence arm the venture arm of an intelligence agency, and they said, we'll give you $40 million on condition that you pivot the company to focus on government, specifically lie detection and surveillance. And it was hard because on the one hand, this was a lot of money for us. We were a small startup at the time, and it would give us runway. At the same time, and if we didn't take the money, we might cease to exist. But I remember going home one night and just thinking, kind of playing out what this would look like. Like, what if we took the money and we kind of pivoted, what it would look like? And it did not align with our core values and why we started the company in the first place. So we turned down the funding and were able to raise money from other investors who align with our core values. That's one example where, and we continue to get inbound interest from a variety of industries, and we say no.
Yeah. So. I mean, it's not easy to do. I mean, you think of Google in China, which I guess made a calculation that it's better to have a terrible Google in China than to not be there at all, which would seem to compromise their fundamental, what they're all about, which is the free exchange of information, access to all information, but then deciding, in this case, we'll be a little less googly and a little more adhering to China's rules. Yeah. We sort of got into the question of bias built into AI, and I think that's one of the most interesting topics. And citizens, we have no idea. I mean, there are occasionally these reports. ProPublica had this report a couple years ago about the bias that I think wasn't even a consideration when sort of the algorithm was made for it was sort of pre-trial assessment or something of a big pool of people, but it really worked to the detriment of African American people in pre-trial, and so that was nowhere in the consideration. The algorithm kicked that out. Again, an unintended consequence. Let's talk about this. How do we deal with the question of bias in the algorithm when there's no transparency to any of us when this is going on?
So, I mean, we can use this specific case and see if we can make some progress. So, what the example is about the use of a variety of data, demographic data, educational data, social data, and so forth, to assess the likelihood of, it depends on whether it's pre-release or parole, but sort of call it, in the parole context, the likelihood of reoffending of somebody who's in prison in order to provide an assessment for whether they should be released on parole early or not. And the result of this was that, in effect, risk scores for African American people in prison were typically sort of coming out on higher than for white Americans, even if the underlying crime or wrong was on par, or if the sort of criminal history was on par. And this is for the obvious reason that race correlates with poverty, with lower degrees of education, with fewer access to various forms of human and social capital in the community that make a difference for whether or not a person makes a positive transition back into their community post-incarceration. And for me, there's been a whole kind of hullabaloo over this, and it's very complicated because there's a couple of different statistical ways for making a judgment about whether the figures count as biased or not. And so the computer scientists will get down on the floor and arm wrestle over this or that statistical approach to the concept of bias is the relevant one. I frankly think one can sidestep that conversation, but at any rate, and what really matters in this space, from my point of view, is actually the first decision that was made. So I'm going to come back to that point. And the first decision that was made in developing this algorithm was to take an approach that had been used in Canada to answer the question of what social supports does a returning offender need in order to succeed. Okay, that was a question the Canadians asked, and then they used a lot of data to try to figure out who needed what kind of social supports, okay? And we Americans turned it into the question of which offender is at the greatest risk of reoffending, okay? Because the same data tells you the same thing, right? The relative likelihood of reoffending is exactly the same as the question of how much support do you need to make a successful transition back into society, okay? So that ultimate purpose, are we trying to help people succeed on reentry, or are we trying to protect society from risky people, completely define the operations of the algorithm. And once that decision was made, it was baked in and nobody was revisiting it. That's the real danger with algorithms, is that first choice of purpose, which gets baked in and does not get revisited. So that's why, from my point of view, the arguments about is it this statistical thing or that are kind of irrelevant. What matters most is, again, that first choice of purpose.
Can I share an example around facial recognition?
Yeah, please.
So you may have seen this in the news. There's been a lot of critique of facial recognition systems that basically discriminate against minority groups, especially women of color. And when you dissect like what's happened there, a lot. So machine learning and AI systems are very data hungry. So you need a ton of data to train these algorithms, and the data really matters. It's not just the quantity, but it's the quality and the type of data you use. So as it turns out, the most readily available data is mostly of middle-aged white men, and that was the majority of the data that was trained to use the algorithm. Now, it was also the majority of the data that was used to test the algorithm, so the accuracy results looked awesome. It was like 96% accurate in finding these faces. The problem is, nobody's looking at, like basically when you're doing machine learning, you need to look at the accuracy by subpopulation, right? You need to look at how well does it do on different groups, and that's the only way you uncover these unintended biases. And so the way to mitigate it is first to ensure the diversity of the data. That's really, really critical. And then it's important that when you're training the algorithms to equally sample data from different, gender groups, age groups, ethnic groups, people with glasses, people with beards, people wearing the hijab, right? And then when you're testing the algorithms, don't just look at one accuracy score like we all used to do. Like if you go back and read my PhD, I just had one accuracy score per emotion or per facial expression 20 years ago. And now I think that should not be acceptable. We need to look at a breakdown of all these accuracy scores to uncover these biases.
Maybe a follow-up question is, so humans, at least for now, are asking these questions and programming the algorithms. Is it realistic to think that AI could ever be less biased than humans?
I mean, in some ways, AI is already less biased than humans. And that's what makes a criminal justice case so challenging, right? Because if you look across the decisions of judges across multiple courtrooms, you will find great variation in decision-making according to whether or not the person had to skip lunch or not. For example, like hungry judges make tougher decisions. Like that's just a feature of human decision-making. So algorithms actually improve on the kind of variability that we see from judges in that kind of context. The problem is that they then introduce other kinds of bias, often hidden bias, and then I would say, again, fundamentally lock in a single purpose, and that, from my point of view, is their greatest danger to us. Algorithms are already better than human beings. It's just that then they're bad at other things that human beings don't even have the chance to do.
I want to follow up on facial recognition, and I'm sure you always get these exact questions, which is, do we want machines reading our, we're not talking about arresting Uyghurs, so that's over there, but do we even want machines reading our facial recognition? Can they do it? What if they get it wrong? We're not really sure, what bias is built in, and these machines are making decisions that it seems like may or may not actually correspond to reality. So that's a softball for you.
Well, actually, we're emotion recognition is actually very different than facial recognition, because when you're looking at people's expressions, you're not really interested in their identity. You just want to know how they're feeling and how they're expressing themselves. And so we actually do not do facial recognition. We never track your identity. We're just interested in your expressions. So I go back to the use case. Like, what is the use case? Why are you collecting that data, and who has control over it? And is it transparent? Is the use case transparent or not? And do you get a say on how that data is being used? I think these are all core values that are important to bake into whatever application is being.
Well, and part of what's inherent is so if I'm, let's say my kids are studying and there's an emotion recognition software and it's reading a certain thing and deciding a certain thing, do I as a parent, or does my child as a student get to appeal or whatever, understand what the algorithm is and what it's saying and the consequences of all of that?
You should.
No, that's a hugely important point, though, actually. And I think that goes to sort of a really deep question of how do we all put ourselves back in a position where we human beings control technology rather than the inverse. Because there is evidence to suggest that even, again, back in the judicial context, when people are given algorithms to support decision making, and even when they're told that the algorithm is just an estimate, that they should actually use their own best judgment, it's just one more piece of evidence that they should factor in, they overweight in the favor of the algorithm. So the algorithm is presumed to be correct, even when there's sort of disalignment with the human judgment. And that's a really, really deep problem. And I don't think I have seen anybody who is sort of tackling that well, the question of how to rebuild human self-confidence in relationship to machines, okay? It's like, yeah, they're good, but, you're all okay. It's like your judgments are still also really, really valuable. And wherever we need to go to rebuild that, just personal human self-confidence, I think is a really pressing question.
I have to say I experimented with one of those. I think I told you this, Rana, at a educational EdTech conference out west, and this was a Chinese-made model, and it was reading faces and reading emotions and body language, and I really didn't know what I was doing and just kind of looking at the thing, and it did flash up confused, which was pretty accurate at the moment.
Can I I want to comment on the education use case, because that's another one where I think, depending on how you craft it, it could be an amazingly transformative use case of the technology. So years ago, I had my daughter, who was about 6 at the time, do Khan Academy. Anybody know that? It's like online math tutoring. She hates math, but I made her do it anyways. And then I asked for her consent to record her expressions while she was doing these online math questions, because I was curious if there were any, could I see any emotional engagement, right? And as it turns out, she was very expressive. So when she got it right, she would perk up. If she got it wrong, you'd see this. And after a while, she was really whiny. But the online learning system was completely oblivious to all of these signals. And it just made me wonder if the system was emotionally intelligent the way an amazing classroom teacher would be. It could personalize the learning experience in ways that don't exist today. So I do think there's great power in this data for education, for democratizing access to education. It just really depends on how you craft it. Yeah, I don't know.
So before we open it up to questions from the floor, since there's an actual ethicist on the platform here, I have to ask you about the trolley problem.
Oh, rats.
So this is basically autonomous vehicles. I mean, this is where you could think of it, that you're building an algorithm, whether it's, do you run over 5 people, or do you swerve to definitely run over one person, and what's the ethical consideration? I mean, we don't have to go into the trolley problem per se, but you are telling the machine to make decisions like that, and right? I mean,
well, again, so here we're going to dodge your question again. So first of all, let me say that the best trolleyologist out there is somebody named Frances Cam, who was a longtime member of the Harvard faculty, and there's a great lecture by her on our website at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics on autonomous vehicles and the trolley problem. But the takeaway from that, the really important point is, if your car is having to make a decision of that kind, you've already screwed up. Think about driver's ed. The point of driver's ed is to make sure that human beings don't end up in that kind of decision-making situation, okay? Right? The point of driver's ed is to make sure you drive safely enough that that's a probability of so close to nil as being irrelevant to the design of the autonomous vehicle system. So basically, if your autonomous vehicle has to face a decision of that kind, you've already screwed up. And then our structure of liability should be absolutely kind of on the case of the company for that.
But hang on. So car driven by a human crosses the meridian and is heading right toward you. That's not, the algorithm hasn't screwed up yet. It now has a pretty weird decision to make very quickly.
It's true that there are certainly plenty of potentially weird decisions, but if Barbara Gross is a computer scientist who also talks a lot about this, and she makes the point that actually, if you're thinking about machine learning and you need data cases to train cars on in relation to that, they don't actually exist. Why not? Because human beings don't face these choices, okay? So why don't human beings face these choices? Because of driver's ed. Okay, and that's not to say that crazy things don't happen ever, right? But they don't happen in a way that constitutes a data set to support machine learning and training of vehicles. So the point is that design has a different problem to deal with, and it's the same as the problem that we use for human beings with driver's ed and licensing, and then the liability structure that attaches to failures of that system, because there will be failures.
You know what I find most fascinating about the trolley problem is that humans can't agree on what the right action to take is, right? I find that really interesting. Like, we can't agree on a set of, moral decisions, or what we, I don't know, what we would deem the right or wrong.
It's because they're so case specific, okay? And so that's exactly the point. And you can't actually do machine learning on those kinds of problems that are so deeply contextually specific, for which there can never be aggregate data sets.
All right, so one more question from me. So, the medical world has its ethic, first do no harm. What does the tech industry have? What should I have? There's a New York Times article that suggested it was build it first and ask for forgiveness later. But, what is the Hippocratic Oath for coders?
We talk about human-centric AI, so let's make artificial intelligence about the humans, not the artificial. We're part of the Partnership on AI Consortium, which was started by the tech giants, and now there's a number of startups as well as other stakeholders like ACLU and Amnesty International. And there we're very focused on building fair, accountable, transparent, and ethical AI. So that's kind of the general guidelines.
So I think this is a conversation we should have, and I think that it's great that there are consortia forming of technologists starting to ask and answer this question. I think the work's still in a beginning phase, to be honest.
Yep.
And I think, in my experience, technologists it's often a new terrain to recognize that the sort of main value to think about is not efficiency. I mean, you've just put a few additional ones on the table, right? Fairness, transparency. Those are not the only values out there. And so from my point of view, the real job at the moment is to make sure technologists are engaging in the full long list of human values that matter to how we build our cities, how we build our platforms, how we build our medical technologies. And so again, I would put beneficence, I would put justice on there alongside fairness, I would put democratic deliberation up there, I would put stewardship, meaning stewardship of human resources over time, so for future generations as well as for ourselves.
I mean, I love, as a computer science undergraduate 100 years ago, I took zero training in ethics. Right? Like as a computer science or an engineer, you don't really take any formal training in some of these, so it's not top of mind when you're designing them. I think it's absolutely critical that today anybody interfacing and or designing, building, and deploying technology needs to be really immersed in these conversations.
There are those who would argue that business education also fails to adequately teach ethics, but that's not for today. So let's open to questions. There are a couple of mic runners back there. I see some hands, and sure, right here. And just sort of general guide rule, one question, keep it short. We'll try to get to a lot of people.
Sure. Thank you so much. As you try to develop general purpose AI, what's your approach to giving it access to the internet?
Sorry, what?
Giving it access to the internet.
But the first...
general purpose AI.
Oh, general purpose AI, giving access to the internet, like just scraping data off the internet? I don't know how to answer that question.
I definitely can't answer that one.
You say no.
I
don't know. I think it depends on what type of data you're considering giving access to. I mean, I think by and large, probably yes. I don't know. It's interesting. I'll think about that.
All right, we're playing Stump the Experts. And let's try another question here.
Hi there. I was wondering, I feel like in today's internet and social media spheres, we usually click I approve of sharing blah blah and that sort of information. But as technology gets bigger and bigger into more the public security sphere of using traffic cams to identify faces and for national security purposes, where do you sort of see people drawing the line between collecting personal information and tracking versus actual national security and federal measures?
I think this is an incredibly hard question, and I think it's one of the ones that we collectively need to be working on. I sort of think of this as something like the Human Genome Project, but for human beings. In other words, so I said at the beginning that one of the things that social media has done, but not just social media, also our now broad aggregate use of data, is to make all of us public persons, even in ways that we don't know. So in other words, we've given up some of our meaningful degrees of control of our privacy and have a kind of public persona operating across the board. Now, there are ways in which one can think about controlling that presently. It can take an awful lot of work to control it to some extent, and sort of Europe has kind of had a set of experiments on trying to help people give themselves control over that public person. We're a long way from understanding at the end of the day what we really want in order to preserve the kind of basic foundations for a free and open democratic society. Our answers are going to have to be different from China's answers, and we haven't really faced that issue squarely either. I mean, it's constantly in the politics of it as people even wrestle with, platform accountability for the Facebooks and the Googles and so forth. But the point is just that it's an incredibly hard conceptual problem, and what we really need is kind of structures for all hands on deck working together on that problem, in the expectation that it will probably take us 10 years to get clear answers and a structure for responding.
Hello.
Good.
Hi, thank you very much for this conversation. My name is Vanessa Newwork. I'm a faculty in Paris. I'm a moral philosopher who was trained also in cognitive science. And I was really interested by the question you asked and the point you made, that the question today is how we can rebuild human confidence toward machine. And I just wanted to question something. Is it to rebuild confidence or to build a new kind of confidence? And how do you think we could do that?
That's a cool question.
Well, that's a really terrific and hard question coming from a moral philosopher, so not surprising. So let me say something about something we're trying to do at Harvard, educationally speaking. It's to your point about the experience that you had as a student. So some colleagues in philosophy and computer science have invented a program called embedded ethics that puts sort of unit ethics modules inside computer science courses so that ethics is not standalone. And I think this is a beautiful structure for rebuilding that kind of confidence, or building a new kind, as you just said. And so what's the new kind of confidence? It, I think, involves two key things. The first is confidence in being able to see the ethics questions in whatever design problem or practical problem one is immersed in, and to know that, one's own intuitions, one's register of, well, there's a problem here, matter and should be taken seriously. And then secondly, to have this sort of self-understanding about ethics, to know how to build partnerships to address finding the answers to those questions. So back to your previous question, like how do you build a partnership to answer those questions? And then actually I will put a third thing on the table too, which is then to recognize that the distinctively human role that as of now, machines are not even remotely close to usurping is that choice of purpose, okay? And that's the thing we all have to understand is our first responsibility, understand what it means to choose the purposes for our machines, for our institutions, for our laws, et cetera.
Okay, next. Hi. I started thinking when you mentioned the Petri dish and the experiments, and it took quite a long time of scientists cutting people open all willy-nilly without their consent and experimenting on prisoners and whatnot for us to make laws about that. Shouldn't we try to come up with an ethical framework that is also embedded in legislation when it comes to what we do with our tech and what we can do with our tech, so that things that would have awful implications never come out of the Petri dish or, well, the coding?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I would agree, and I think that you can look at a couple of different historical cases to give you a sense of time scale for how long it takes human beings to kind of wrestle technology under control. So one case is to think about industrialization in the early 19th century. Massive technological transformation to the global economy. What's the result in England in the middle of the 19th century? Like cities that are just full of black air, right? Like really, really terrible pollution. And then it takes quite an extended period of time for the world to figure out how to solve that problem and get that under control. Have we solved the problem of fossil fuels and their impact on our world? No, right? But if you think about that passage from industrialization to the present, that gives you one arc of time for watching how human beings have regained or not control over technology. Nuclear weapons are another critical case to think about how we've done that. Science is another one. So the science case, the sort of bioethics piece, is actually on a slightly faster timetable than, say, the fossil fuels case. So I think we could learn a lot from it and help tech companies think about governance committees inside the company. You know, what are the kind of regular commissions we should have working in the government to coordinate across branches as new emerging technologies trigger issues in different policy domains, that kind of thing.
There are also big global efforts that people are trying to put forward. I mean, I know Human Rights Watch on the military thing is trying to get, a basic commitment, whatever it's worth, that, machines will not make decisions to drop bombs or whatever to kill people without some sort of human intervention. On cybersecurity, cyber warfare, there's an effort, actually, Brad Smith again of Microsoft is kind of leading it, to create a digital Geneva Convention. So if the original Geneva Convention was about innocence and refugees and people harmed by war, that this would be kind of the ground rules. I mean, companies like Microsoft will get called in by their governments when there are cyber attacks to help figure out what happened, and they sort of want ground rules that says we will not, for example, sign off on a cyber attack against an innocent. Sort of a basic thing. But there's a lot to be done. It's really hard to bring everybody together to do that.
Hi, thank you for having this panel. I've been wanting to ask this for a while and don't want to stir things up, but I'm just curious about what it could give to the question of Twitter's role in the current president's use of the platform, and whether or not it's gone too far, or whether or not they have some role to play in shutting off the use of that.
I'm going to defer to the ethicist on the panel.
Yeah, me too.
I'm just a technologist.
Yeah. So that's a tough one. I mean, I don't think they can change their rules midstream, to be honest. So I think in that regard, we're kind of stuck with their current rules throughout the course of this process. But I think that they should be revisiting their rules, and on some timetable that's not connected to this process, achieving a change.
Hi, I also want to say thank you for this discussion. I think it's really important. I help teach in MIT's System Design and Management program, and so we're a joint engineering management degree. And so this comes up in conversations of large complex systems. And to the comment of I'm just a technologist and the analogy of the Hippocratic Oath, how do you address the connectedness issue of, like, say, the medical professional providing care to a patient is very interpersonal, but the software developer in San Francisco is not very connected to the person using the technology or being influenced or affected by it. So if you could just discuss that a little bit, I'd appreciate it.
I mean, I think this is changing. I don't think you can get away with saying you're just the technologist. I don't think this is going to work anymore. I do think there needs to be design thinking elements in how we approach this, clearly defining the purpose. In fact, we talk about participatory design, so bringing the end users around the table, the stakeholders, and how we think about designing and building these technologies. So I really think that technologists and machine learning scientists and software developers need to be at the forefront of engaging with how this is going to get used.
All right, I think we have time, sadly, just for one more question.
Hi, thank you so much. My question is about, human enhancement technologies. So, for example, in areas not just prosthetics, which is more external, but gene editing and things like that. When you say we should think human-centered AI, that's literally human-centered AI. So I'm just wondering, how should we approach that? How should we think about it? What's a framework evaluating whether we're playing God or just helping humanity advance?
So it's funny, I was actually thinking of a gene editing comment in relationship to the previous question, so I can pull them together. So gene editing is a super fascinating case, and for exactly the reason that you raised, because a given doctor will look at a specific patient and say, I can help this patient, with this particular result of gene editing technology. And from the point of view of medical commitments, Hippocratic Oath and so forth, be inclined to want to sort of pursue X usage of gene technology in some fashion or other. And the tricky thing is exactly that. gene editing simultaneously has impacts on the micro relationship between doctor and patient, and therefore falls under the cover of the professional ethics of medicine, but it also has the capacity to have macro effects. So to the degree, for example, that gene editing could give a state, a sovereign state, sort of powerful control over reproduction or something like that, it produces macro policy questions, okay? And so I think that's kind of the issue that you were pointing at. I think in the tech world, the macro questions are obvious first before the micro relational effects and impacts, and we have to be able to think about both. So we need professional ethics to think about the doctor's decision in relationship to gene editing, about are we treating and seeking medical cures, not doing any medical harm, right? And at the same time, simultaneously, we have to have a kind of macro level conversation about the policy domains that where there are implications of the technology, because now there's a different approach to reproductive issues and reproductive rights, or whatever X macro question is. And I think as long as we can think about both things simultaneously, we have all the underlying capacities and institutions and structures for exploring these questions. We just have to actually activate them for this new set of questions that have emerged.
So a lot of these questions are, suspicious maybe of technology and technology companies. Rana, do you want to have the last word and kind of address all of that?
I think technology is wonderful. We just have to, really, there's a lot of potential for doing amazing things to improve. And, I think of AI as a partnership. It's going to help us be safer, more productive, healthier. We just have to, as a society, commit to applying it and building it in that way.
Oh, great. So
it'll be good.
This was really fun for me to be able to have two really smart people here and throw questions at them like, what about Facebook? And to get really...
We didn't answer that one, I'm sorry.
No, you did duck that one, that's true. Well, who knows what the hell
yes,
about Facebook.
They should be regulated.
You still post pictures of your granddaughter?
Yes, I do still post pictures of my granddaughter, even though I've been ostracized by my friends for that. Anyway, amazing discussion. Please join me in thanking these two amazing speakers.